What if one of Africa's most overlooked resources is not buried underground but lying beside the road? Imagine an old tire abandoned after years of service in Burkina Faso. To most people, its useful life is over. The same might be said of a container of used motor oil drained from an aging vehicle, or a pile of discarded plastic collected from homes and businesses. They look like waste. They can pollute the soil, contaminate water, and become another burden for communities already facing difficult economic choices. But Burkina Faso is beginning to tell a different story. Some local companies are collecting these materials and attempting to turn them back into economic value. Used tires and plastic can be processed into fuel and other materials. Used motor oil can be treated and transformed into new lubricants. Discarded plastic can become household products. Even residues from shea processing can find another purpose instead of simply being thrown away. That raises a much larger question. Who should capture the value hidden inside Africa's resources, including resources that have already been used once? Under President Ibrahim Traore, Burkina Faso has increasingly emphasized domestic production, local processing, job creation, and a development model that seeks greater national economic capacity. He did not create Burkina Faso's recycling industry, and several waste programs existed before he came to power. But the companies we are examining today fit into a broader debate that has become increasingly important during his leadership. How much value can Burkina Faso create and retain at home? This story is therefore about much more than recycling. We will examine what these factories are actually doing, where the jobs and economic opportunities may come from, what role government policy plays, and where the environmental and financial risks remain. We will also examine Western concerns without assuming that every criticism is an attack on African sovereignty. And finally, we will ask whether this experiment contains a larger lesson for Africa. If you value careful reporting on Africa's changing economic future, follow this channel, because sometimes a major story of sovereignty can begin with something as ordinary as an old tire. To understand why this matters, consider the traditional life of a product. A tire is manufactured, purchased, used until it wears out, and eventually discarded. Motor oil is poured into an engine, used for thousands of miles, drained and replaced. Plastic packaging serves its purpose for a short time and then becomes waste. This is a linear economy. Resources enter at one end and waste leaves at the other. For Burkina Faso, that waste creates two problems at the same time. The first is environmental. Used oil that is improperly discarded can contaminate soil and water. Plastic can accumulate across communities, while old tires can remain in the environment for years. The second problem receives less attention. Every material that is discarded while it still contains usable value represents an economic opportunity that has been lost. A circular economy attempts to change that equation. Instead of asking only how to dispose of an old tire, the question becomes what useful materials can still be recovered from it. Instead of treating used motor oil as the end of a process, businesses can collect and treat it as an input for another process. Plastic that once had almost no value to its owner can be collected, sorted, processed, and transformed into another product. That change creates an entirely different economic chain. Someone must collect the waste, someone must transport it, workers must sort and prepare it, technicians must operate the machinery, factories must process the material, finished products must then be packaged, distributed, and sold. This is why the strategic question facing Burkina Faso goes beyond environmental protection. The country is asking whether materials already circulating inside its economy can support more production inside the country rather than simply becoming pollution and expense. That does not mean every piece of waste is valuable or that recycling automatically makes a country economically independent. Technology costs money. Collection systems must function. Products must meet quality standards, and customers must actually want to buy them. But the principle is important. Before Burkina Faso can retain more value from its resources, it must first recognize where that value exists. And in this emerging industrial story, some of that value may be sitting in garages, workshops, streets, and discarded tires across the country. The clearest example of this new thinking can be found at ARTIS INDUSTRIE, one of the facilities visited during Burkina Faso's Environment and Eco-Citizenship Week in June 2026. Its business begins with materials most people would rather see disappear: discarded tires and plastic waste. Instead of sending those materials directly to a landfill or leaving them scattered in the environment, the company collects and processes them to recover useful products, including fuel. The process used for tires is known as pyrolysis. The basic idea is easier to understand than the technical name suggests. Tires are heated under controlled conditions with very little oxygen. As the material breaks down, different components can be recovered. These can include liquid oil, gas, carbon-rich material, and metal from the tire structure. For Burkina Faso, the significance is not simply technical. The Environmental Intervention Fund selected an ARTIS Industrie project for financial support of approximately 299 million CFA francs, or roughly 540,000 United States dollars, using an approximate conversion. The project was designed to increase the recovery of plastic waste and used tires and transform them into diesel fuel and other useful products. That public support reveals something important. Waste recovery is being treated not merely as a cleanup operation, but as an activity capable of supporting domestic production. Still, the claims must remain realistic. A facility producing fuel from tires does not mean Burkina Faso has solved its national fuel needs. To make that argument, we would need reliable information about actual annual output, production costs, fuel quality, collection capacity, energy consumption, and the size of the national market. The stronger argument is also the simpler one. A tire that once represented a disposal problem can become an industrial input. It can support collection, transportation, processing, technical work, and eventually the sale of another product. That is where this story begins to touch the larger question of sovereignty. Burkina Faso does not become economically independent because one factory processes old tires, but every additional stage performed inside the country creates an opportunity to retain skills, income, and productive capacity that might otherwise never exist. And that makes the discarded tire something more than waste. It becomes a test of whether value can be created again. Tires are only one part of this emerging chain. Used motor oil and discarded plastic show how the same principle can operate through different industries. At Sibalab, used oil collected from garages, businesses, and other sources can become an industrial input instead of being discarded into the environment. The company reports processing capacity of about 30,000 liters per day, with the possibility of expanding that capacity. Through treatment and refining, used oil can be recovered and transformed into base oils and finished lubricants for the local market. That distinction matters. 30,000 liters of processing capacity does not necessarily mean 30,000 liters are processed. Actual production depends on collection, demand, equipment, and operating conditions. Yet the industrial logic remains significant. A container of used oil can move from a garage to a collector, then to a processing facility, and eventually return to the economy as a useful product. Recaplas demonstrates another version of the same idea. Plastic waste can be collected and transformed into household goods such as basins, buckets, brushes, and other items. Instead of recovering energy by turning waste into fuel, this approach keeps material in productive use through a new physical product. Government policy is also changing the environment in which these companies operate. Burkina Faso adopted stronger legislation concerning plastic bags and packaging, while the Environmental Intervention Fund has financed projects intended to reduce plastic pollution, support alternatives, and expand waste recovery. This creates a chain with several participants. The state establishes rules and provides financial tools. Collectors recover materials that might otherwise remain scattered across communities. Private companies invest in equipment and processing. Workers transform those materials. Distributors bring the finished products to market. Consumers then determine whether the entire system can survive commercially. That last step cannot be ignored. A recycled product that nobody wants to buy does not create a sustainable industry. Quality, price, safety, and reliability remain essential. This is why Burkina Faso's experiment should not be measured simply by counting factories. The deeper measure is whether those factories can connect waste collection to competitive production and lasting demand. If that connection succeeds, what once looked like an environmental burden begins to function as a domestic value chain. The value created by recycling does not stop at the factory gate. For ordinary families, one of the most important questions is whether this emerging industry can create dependable work. Consider what must happen before an abandoned tire becomes an industrial input. Someone has to find it, collect it, move it to a collection point, transport it to a processing facility, sort it, and prepare it. Once inside the factory, workers operate equipment, maintain machinery, monitor production, handle finished materials, and prepare products for distribution. The same chain exists for used oil and plastic waste. This matters because every additional stage performed inside Burkina Faso creates another opportunity for income. A waste collector may occupy the first position in the chain, but that person is connected to drivers, technicians, factory workers, distributors, retailers, and other businesses. Companies featured in the recycling initiative have reported ambitious employment figures. Some have spoken of hundreds of direct jobs and much larger numbers of indirect jobs connected to collection and related activities. These figures should be treated as company estimates rather than verified national employment statistics. What matters more than any single headline number is whether these jobs become stable, productive, and economically sustainable. There is already evidence that waste processing can support employment. Cadiplast, another company involved in Burkina Faso's campaign against plastic pollution, has been reported to process about 6 tons of plastic bags per day while providing jobs connected to that activity. For an older viewer, the economic meaning is straightforward. A job is never merely a statistic on a government report. It can mean food for a household, school expenses for grandchildren, transportation, medical costs, and a measure of security for an entire family. But lasting employment cannot depend forever on subsidies or political enthusiasm. The collection network must deliver enough material, factories must operate efficiently, products must meet acceptable standards, customers must continue buying them. That is the real test. If Burkina Faso can connect environmental cleanup with commercially sustainable production, recycling can become more than a public service. It can become part of an industrial economy in which something once considered worthless supports livelihoods at several stages before returning to the market as value. The same question of value becomes even clearer when we move from urban waste to one of West Africa's familiar agricultural resources, shea. For generations, shea has supported livelihoods across Burkina Faso, particularly among women involved in collecting and processing the nuts. But the economic story does not end when shea butter is produced. Processing also leaves residues, and those residues raise the same question we asked about old tires and used oil. Must a byproduct remain waste, or can it become an input for something else? Research in Burkina Faso shows that residues from shea processing can be reused, including as a source of energy for processing operations. In the company accounts examined earlier, residues were also described as being supplied to a local partner for biological compost. That specific arrangement comes from the company's own description, but the broader principle is well established. Agricultural byproducts can have another economic life. This brings us to a deeper issue. Burkina Faso may produce the shea nut, but producing the raw material does not automatically mean capturing most of its final value. Value increases as shea moves through processing, refining, quality control, packaging, branding, distribution, and eventually into products sold to consumers. When many of those higher value stages occur elsewhere, The country that supplied the original resource may receive only a limited share of the final economic reward. This pattern is not unique to shea. It has appeared across Africa with minerals, agricultural commodities, and other raw materials for generations. That is why the recycling story matters beyond environmental policy. Whether the starting material is a shea nut, an old tire, discarded plastic, or used motor oil, the strategic question remains remarkably similar. How many stages of transformation can be performed locally, and how much knowledge, employment, and income can remain within the country? Shea also reminds us that industrial development does not have to mean replacing agriculture. The two can reinforce each other. When agricultural production feeds local processing, and processing residues find another productive use, one resource can support several layers of economic activity. And that brings us directly to Ibrahim Traore and the larger idea now shaping Burkina Faso's development debate. Producing resources is important, but transforming them at home may matter even more. This is where Ibrahim Traore enters the story, but his role must be understood carefully. Burkina Faso did not begin recycling when Traore came to power. Waste management programs existed before his leadership, and there is no evidence that he founded ARTIS INDUSTRIE, Recuplast, or Sibalab. Presenting these factories as personal projects of the president would exaggerate what the evidence supports. His influence lies somewhere more important. Traore has repeatedly emphasized domestic processing, industrialization, local production, job creation, and a development model intended to reduce Burkina Faso's dependence on value created elsewhere. His message is essentially that possessing resources is not enough. The country must develop the capacity to transform more of those resources at home. That philosophy can be applied to waste as well. In 2023, Burkina Faso's Environment Ministry connected a program worth 750 million CFA francs, approximately 1.3 million United States dollars, for fighting plastic pollution with Traore's call to improve living conditions, reduce environmental risk, and create green employment. In 2026, waste management and job creation again appeared among instructions communicated to regional authorities. This does not prove that Traore personally designed Burkina Faso's recycling strategy. It shows something more measured. Recycling businesses are operating within a political environment where domestic transformation has gained greater strategic importance. Consider the principle. Cotton grown in Burkina Faso creates one level of value. Turning cotton into fabric creates another. Agricultural products create more value when they are processed and packaged. The same logic can extend to secondary resources. An old tire can become an industrial input. Used oil can become lubricant. Plastic can become another household product. Traore did not create the tire, and he did not invent the technology that processes it. His political significance to this story lies in the question his development agenda repeatedly raises. When a resource exists inside Burkina Faso, who will transform it? Who will develop the skills? And who will capture the resulting value? That is a more serious measure of leadership than attaching one man's name to every factory. The real test will be whether this political vision can help create competitive businesses that continue producing value long after speeches and ceremonies have ended. Economic sovereignty, however, should not be confused with economic isolation. For Burkina Faso, producing more at home does not require rejecting every foreign machine, investor, technology, or trading partner. No modern industrial economy develops entirely by itself. Factories need equipment. Engineers need knowledge. Businesses need financing. Producers need access to markets. And some technologies may initially have to come from abroad. The more useful question is what remains in Burkina Faso after those partnerships take place. If machinery is imported but Burkinabe workers learn to operate and maintain it, local capacity grows. If foreign capital helps establish a factory while production, employment, and part of the profits remain inside the country, more value can circulate locally. If technology acquired from abroad eventually allows local companies to develop their own expertise, dependence can gradually decline. This is the practical meaning of industrial sovereignty. It is not about closing the border, it is about strengthening the country's ability to make choices. Traore's broader development message has repeatedly emphasized local processing and consumption of locally produced goods. In that framework, the recycling industry offers a useful example. Used oil collected inside Burkina Faso can be processed for the domestic market. Plastic waste can become products used by Burkinabe households. Tires that once represented a disposal cost can potentially supply useful industrial materials. But local production deserves support only if it can deliver real value. A lubricant does not become reliable simply because it was produced in Burkina Faso. Recycled household goods still need acceptable quality. Fuel recovered from waste must meet appropriate standards. Patriotic enthusiasm may persuade a customer to try a local product once, but quality and price determine whether that customer returns. That distinction matters for every African country considering a similar strategy. Sovereignty is stronger when local businesses can compete, not when competition is merely avoided. Burkina Faso can therefore cooperate with outside investors while seeking to retain more skills, processing, employment, and productive knowledge at home. The two goals are not necessarily contradictory. The real measure will come years later. After the equipment has been purchased and the ceremonies have ended, will Burkina Faso possess stronger companies, more capable workers, deeper technical knowledge, and greater freedom to decide what happens to its own resources? That is where industrial sovereignty becomes something measurable rather than simply a political slogan. But there is another side to this story. Turning an old tire into fuel does not automatically make the process clean, profitable, or sustainable. The technology used to break down tires requires controlled heating and energy. If a facility does not properly manage emissions, gases, carbon-rich residues, and other byproducts, one environmental problem can simply be replaced by another. The quality of the recovered fuel also matters. A product that damages engines or fails to meet acceptable standards will not build a lasting market. There is also an important distinction between recycling material and recovering energy. When discarded plastic is transformed into a basin or another durable product, the material remains in economic use. When a tire or plastic waste is converted into fuel, and that fuel is burned, some value has been recovered, but the material does not continue circulating indefinitely. This is why fuel recovery should not be presented as a perfect environmental solution. Then comes the economic challenge. A factory needs a dependable supply of waste. Tires scattered across distant communities must be collected and transported. Used oil must be kept separate from contaminants. Different plastics may need sorting. All of this costs money before processing even begins. A large factory can therefore face a surprising problem, having machinery but not enough suitable material arriving at the gate. And production is only half the equation. The finished fuel, lubricant, or recycled product must have customers willing to pay a competitive price. A plant designed to process 30,000 liters per day has not necessarily achieved that production level every day, and installed capacity should never be confused with actual output. These limitations do not make Burkina Faso's effort meaningless. They establish the standard by which its success should eventually be judged. How much waste is actually recovered? How much is transformed? What does production cost? Are emissions properly controlled? Are the products competitive? How many stable jobs survive without permanent subsidies? Those questions are not attacks on African sovereignty. They are exactly the questions a serious sovereign industrial strategy should be prepared to answer. Because if Burkina Faso wants to demonstrate that discarded materials can become national value, the strongest evidence will not come from slogans. It will come from factories that remain productive, safe, competitive, and useful year after year. The final question is how the outside world should judge what Burkina Faso is attempting. There is no credible evidence that Western governments are alarmed because one Burkinabe company can turn old tires into fuel. The real Western concerns are broader. They include the growing role of the state, investment risks, political governance, transparency, security, and Burkina Faso's deteriorating relationship with France. Some of those concerns deserve serious consideration. If Burkina Faso wants to prove that greater economic sovereignty works, the strongest response is not another political slogan. It is evidence, competitive products, transparent results, safer communities, profitable businesses, and jobs that last. That is also the larger lesson for Africa. Ghana does not need to copy Burkina Faso. Nigeria, Kenya, Mali, and Niger do not need identical tire processing plants. Each country should begin with its own resources and ask where value is being lost. What is being discarded? What is exported with little processing? Which stages can be performed locally? Where is foreign cooperation useful? And how can local workers gain skills from it? For Mali and Niger, cooperation with Burkina Faso across the Sahel could eventually offer another possibility. A regional market can provide more waste material, more customers, and greater industrial scale than 3 isolated national markets. Under leaders such as Ibrahim Traore, Assimi Goïta, and Abdourahmane Chiani, that question now sits inside a wider debate about economic sovereignty in West Africa. The African Union and the wider Africa News conversation should watch the results rather than the rhetoric. Relations with France may rise or fall, but the economic test remains unchanged. An old tire cannot create sovereignty by itself. But when Africans collect a discarded resource, develop the skills to transform it, manufacture something useful, employ local workers, and retain more value inside African economies, a small piece of the structure begins to change. That may be Burkina Faso's most important message. Africa's future will not be determined only by what lies beneath its soil. It may also depend on how intelligently Africans use what they already have. If you want to follow that transformation across Africa, subscribe to this channel, because the next story of African value may already be hiding in plain sight. We sincerely appreciate your time and support. Every video on this channel is carefully researched, thoughtfully written, and meticulously edited by our dedicated team. We don't rely on automated production or shortcuts to create our content. Every story, every visual, and every detail is crafted with genuine care, passion, and a commitment to bringing you meaningful, high-quality videos.